Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. I begin in the name of God, all merciful, and I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship except Him, and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is His final slave and messenger. This topic, the question, is science the new religion? I decided on this title, and I actually did it with the intention to make it a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Because if you look at the Oxford Dictionary of what this definition of religion is, it refers to a belief in a supernatural being, a God that is worshipped, and that this God has brought about the universe. So, in that sense, science, strictly speaking, is not a religion. But what I really wanted to address was the fact that we nowadays are using science for something that it was never meant to be used for. And that is for it to be used to depict our worldview, the way we look at man, as well as life, as well as the universe. Now, while we can understand that science will help us understand more about the material universe, will science really give us the insights? And was it, more importantly, was it ever meant to give us the insights to what the purpose of humanity is and the purpose of life? Because, brothers, sisters and friends, every human being has to ask themselves three fundamental questions, and has asked themselves three fundamental questions at one point or another in their life. That is, where have they come from? What are they doing on this during their life and on this planet Earth? And thirdly, where are they going? What happens after death? Every human being, I guarantee, has thought about these three questions at one point or another in their life. The fact is that I just wanted to spend a little time to look at the history of science with relation to religion, or with relation to philosophy. Because traditionally, philosophy is the area or the branch of human knowledge which has been concerned with discovering and helping human beings understand the purpose of life, and also ultimately what happens after death and what happened before birth. And that religion also comes in as a subset of philosophy in that sense. And that's the way it's always been. Science has always meant to be dealing with material, tangible phenomena. Phenomena that can be witnessed by the five senses, namely sight, hearing, touch, taste and smell. And this is why if you go to Cambridge University and you are to study physics or biology or chemistry, you will study a degree and you will obtain your degree in natural sciences, because that's what science has been divided into. That they are being specific in saying that science, as we know it today, is actually the natural sciences, because it doesn't take account of the social sciences. We know there are universities, every single university has a separate faculty for social sciences. It has a separate faculty for psychology. It has a separate faculty for philosophy and religion. And natural science, physical sciences are separated. So why is it that we are allowing, or it's become popular to allow science to dictate, actually, what our view on man, life and the universe ultimately is? And the reason for that is that it is actually a reaction. It's a reaction to the history and the tensions between science and Christianity in the West. For example, as we know, that Western Christianity, this is obviously the pre-Reformation, the Pope and the clergy of the Catholic Church pretty much dictated the way that Christians, being the main religion of the people in the West, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, the Pope saw it fit in his capacity to dictate the worldview, to dictate what human beings, what the relationship with God is, which you take as a given because he's the head of a religious institution. But not just that, but what is the human being's relation to the natural world and to their fellow human being? In other words, the Catholic Church sought to completely dictate what is the way to view man, life, and the universe, and also the sciences that occur therein. Now, during this time, we find that a number of scientists, such as Galileo and others, and his contemporaries, were making significant discoveries, significant scientific discoveries. However, the problem was that many of these were contradictory to the diktats of the Catholic Church of the time. And actually, poor Galileo recanted a number of his positions. He took what some would argue the easy way out, but there were many other scientists that didn't, and as a result they were heavily persecuted and they were actually excommunicated. Excommunication in the Catholic Church means that you are no longer part of the church, and therefore you do not have a path to salvation anymore. Salvation in the hereafter, and you are out of contract, if you like, with God. That was the reaction. So you can understand that a tension is being built up now between science and religion. And not only that, we know the Catholic Church had its fingers in many different pies. Politically, it was causing a lot of strife. We know about the 80-year war, which occurred in the Netherlands, again between Protestants and Catholics, which came afterwards. And again, before that, the Reformation, Martin Luther had a problem theologically with the position of the Catholic Church and the Pope, which is why he then sought to right a number of contentions he had with the Catholic Church, and that became the beginning of the split between the Protestants and the Catholic Church within Western Christianity. It is true that before that there was a schism already between Western and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but that was not really for these reasons. So we find that Martin Luther has now set the way of disagreeing, and therefore disagreeing with the infallibility of the Pope. And this now sets the scene. Further down the line, fast forwarding, we now move to the Enlightenment, where the theme of the Enlightenment, the motto of the Enlightenment was that whatever can be learned will be learned. Whatever can be known shall be known. Because now the Enlightenment has, due to the Protestant Reformation and the splitting of the Catholic Church, they don't feel no longer bound to the church authority of their time. So even the Protestant authority does not have a say in the areas that the Catholic Pope did. So we find now that philosophically people are thinking more liberally. People like John Locke and Kant and others are now paving the framework for what we now know and still have inherited today to be Western thought, Western liberal thought. And part of that was the notion of empiricism. What is empiricism? Empiricism is to do with things that we can detect with the five senses. So the philosophy behind this is that there is no truth, and no truth can be attained except by the five senses. So now you can see that this ties in very nicely with science, because remember what we discussed before, that what science deals with is what can be measured, what can be detected, and what can be perceived by the five senses. And that's what science is. The scientific method is simply about having a hypothesis, conducting some experiments, and seeing if a hypothesis holds true or not. And this is why Albert Einstein actually, he said that no one can prove any scientific theory right. You can merely try to prove it wrong. And if you don't prove it wrong, then all you can say is that we have not proven it wrong. So that even the notion of truth in science doesn't really exist. It is a relativistic term, because remember, if you've just conducted some experiments, or you have a theory or a hypothesis, then all you can say is that this is the best that we know right now. And you can understand that that would be very problematic. For example, if we were to use science in order to determine morality, you could never have any rules or laws or governing of a state. For example, or of any society. Why? Because as soon as a policeman arrested you, you would say, sorry officer, right now, my morality is evolving, and my morality is actually more advanced than yours, and that of the state. And so, right now, what you're arresting me for now, you will not arrest me for in 10 years' time. And so, therefore, it is wrong for you to punish me for being so advanced. So, run along back to your panda car. And that's what would happen. You would have no way of fixing anything. Because the scientific progression and scientific method is a very constant progress. And not just that, but it ties in with the whole premise or the prejudicial argument that there's only matter in the world. Ironically, science has actually discovering a lot of matter, for example, antimatter, negative mass, a lot of concepts which can't actually be determined by the five senses. Science is now traveling in a different direction, and it's actually going to things that we can't necessarily perceive. And yet the physics and the mathematical theory would determine it exists. For example, if any of you have studied mathematics to any advanced level, you will come across complex numbers. You understand what complex numbers are, right? Where the square root of -1 is involved. The square root of anything else, that's a very abstract concept. And you think, well, why would they think of something like that? The interesting thing is that these complex numbers are actually used in engineering applications to this day. In electrical engineering, they use complex numbers, which are numbers made up of real parts and imaginary parts. So numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and also decimal and also negative numbers, and an imaginary part, a multiple of the square root of -1, which is known as I, or denoted as I. So you're finding certain things being solved by things which are not scientifically proven. Because interestingly enough, even though mathematics is the language of science, without a doubt, it does not fall into science. It actually it has its own separate branch. It has its own mathematics and logic are considered part of the logical sciences. Because they don't discuss or they don't go into the things that we can materially see, feel, hear, smell, touch and taste. Yet we believe those to be maybe some form of truth. So you can see that if we were to now look at human beings in this somewhat simplistic way, this material way, then you will never really answer those three fundamental questions which every human being asks. And the question has to be, why do those human beings, and why does every single human being ask those questions? Because we can at least agree that if every human being is answering this question, then it must be a very important question. These must be very important questions that we are hardwired to answer. And it comes down to a number of basic fundamentals. Because we know from our logic, and if we use, again, the science of mathematics and logic, and flawless logic, not contrived logic, I'm talking about the same logic that you use when you go and shop in your local supermarket and determine which is the best deal. That's all I'm talking about here. That if, as a human being, we realize that everything around us, anything which has form and function, that has a shape and a purpose, then we know for a fact that something or somebody, forget the nature of that thing, let's say that something intelligently designed it. We know that this bottle of water has been designed. Even though it's quite, it's not the most advanced thing in the world, but we know that it's been designed. And no matter what we say, no matter what we fall into some of the absurd arguments of the real fundamentalist Darwinian evolutionists, we can never, and nobody would ever say, and neither would they say, that there was a possibility that this bottle evolved from somewhere. That given the right temperature, the right conditions, the right materials, and given as long as you want, millions of years, billions of years, okay, let's say trillions of years, could it be possible, could anybody reasonably say that this bottle of water actually evolved from nothing? Or from random occurrences? No, nobody would ever say that. Or anything of the machines that we have. Think of the vast structures that we have. Think of the huge engineering that goes into some of the great things that human beings have developed. But all of that pales into insignificance when you think about the way that a simple cell, the building block of life, the basic building block of any life, the advanced nature that it has, the ability to have, the ability to regulate, to respire, take in what it needs, and to excrete whatever it needs to excrete for it to function for thousands and thousands and thousands of seconds and minutes through a person's life. Think about that. Is it possible that that which behaves in a more advanced way than any of the machines that we have today, is it possible that that could have come out of nowhere? And this is, but this is what many scientists are saying. They are saying that yes, it is possible to believe that. We don't necessarily have to have this purpose. And if we human beings feel, if this bottle can have a purpose, then it's absurd to believe that anything more advanced, such as human beings, do not have a purpose. Alhamdulillah, serving its purpose very well. It's really quenching my thirst, alhamdulillah. So we as human beings, it is absurd for us to believe that given the advanced nature of everything that we do, and the sophistication that human beings have, in not just physical action, but in thought, in terms of development, in terms of our contribution to the universe, then surely we must have a purpose as well. And what can give us that purpose? Because we as human beings, given that we have our own unique backgrounds, our own unique circumstances, our own unique biases and weaknesses and such like, it really wouldn't be right if we human beings admit that we are equal to each other in status. It would not be right for any of us to dictate to another human being what right or wrong is, or what good or bad is, or what morality is. Because that will change. That will become a process of time. And unfortunately, Nazi Germany was a result of a vast number of human beings getting together, and a lot of them were very intelligent, mind you, and agreeing that Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, anybody who is not part of the Aryan race should be exterminated, or subjugated at least for the service of the white Aryan race. And this was democratically done. So surely democracy, in principle, cannot be used to define morality. Because if enough corrupt people decide that something is right, then surely government has to carry that out, regardless. And I'm sure none of us would agree to that. So it makes sense, surely, that we refer to the designer of the heavens and the earth, of the universe. But surely if they put us there, if they designed us, or even started the process of, let's not go into the discussion of how that happened, but if we believe that there was an initial source of that creation, that design, then surely we should realize that they have made us with the consciousness to think about our purpose. And therefore every human being is crying out for this purpose. And so we should refer to that being for that purpose. Because even if we were to get a mobile phone, a brand new mobile phone, we've got our upgrade, we're so happy that we've got the latest smartphone, and we're dying to take it out, and we open it up, and it's all beautifully wrapped, and also we don't want to kind of open it, it's all so nicely packaged. But then when we open it, we want to use it, we will look for the guide on how to use it, how to get started. You'd have the thick manual, which you think, no, I don't want to go into the thick manual right now, I'll use that for the advanced stuff later. How can I get started? How can I plug the charger in? Do I need to charge the battery up, or is it charged already? You go to the quick start guide and you want to start using it. So the same way we as human beings need that, because the world isn't working right now. Human beings are making a very bad job of everything right now. Because let's face it, most systems in the world today, most governments are running on man-made rules. Let's not go into the democracies or dictatorships, but they're all man-made, ultimately. Human beings have thought this is the best way to do things, for whatever reason, regardless of the interests. But this actually ties into what I'm saying, that people will rule by their interests, even if it's democratically done. You see that in democracies, even in the West UK, United States and the United Kingdom, you will find that people are ruling their interests. Look at wars that are fought in our name, in our so-called freedoms, which we were not consulted over, which we find that there are other political bargains being made behind the scenes, which we are not privy to or we have no say over. Then we can see categorically that the world isn't working this way. In fact, 90% of the world's wealth is owned by 5% of people, which is absolutely absurd. And this is the result of materialism, brothers, sisters and friends. Why? Because if you believe that we have come by random process and we are now on this earth, then why would you do anything which was not in your own selfish interests? Hey, in fact, you can even argue it's survival of the fittest, right? If you're a Darwinian evolutionist, then you will have to say it's survival of the fittest. Tough. That's just, you're the weakest link, so that's it, goodbye. I'm going to step over you and I will do what I like. And this is why Hitler, actually, interestingly enough, was very keen on Darwin's evolution theory, because it tied in very nicely with his worldview. The idea that the whites were the most developed and evolved of mankind. Because for him, unfortunately, black African people were a bit too maybe primitive for him. And in fact, at the time of Darwin, when Darwin came out with this theory, a number of Christian teachings were actually saying that African people and black people were actually the cursed children of Ham. Because according to Christian theology, Ham was the son that laughed at his father's nakedness. Noah's son, who had Ham, Sam, and Japheth, which in Arabic is Ham, Sam, and Japheth, that they believed that he was the son that laughed at his father's nakedness when he accidentally burst in upon him, and therefore the whole nation was cursed, which would then curse the whole of the African and Indian nations. That was the worldview at the time. And so it tied in very well, because they said that these are less evolved species. And this was the worldview at the time. Let's go to the other extreme, communists. Communists believed took evolution one step further and then merged it with the whole development of the universe. They said, well, the way the whole universe came about was by evolution, and then eventually human beings came about as a result of this evolution. So evolution and belief in the merely scientific view of the world will only lead you to accept a very materialistic view of life. Because look, if you see human beings as just a collection of cells, and they are just a collection of molecules, then why would you care if you just exterminate a lot of them? Again, to go back to the example of Hitler, he could argue from that basis that by just gassing the Jews and by killing them, exterminating them, you're just merely changing molecules from one form to another. Because of the principle of conservation of mass and energy, which is a physical theory, then hey, it doesn't really matter. They've just turned into another form of life. And who's to say that one form of life or one form of existence is better than another? Who can say that? If you take that materialistic view of man, life, and the universe. And that is, again, the only logical conclusion that you can come about with that. So, again, science cannot prove what's going to happen after a person dies. It cannot show you where you are going after life. And again, given that human beings, again from a humanity and sociological point of view, all human beings value justice. Even the child, when they're running around and they hit themselves by a table leg, and the parents, how do the parents pacify the child? By hitting the table leg. Because the child is, again, hardwired to accept and look for justice. And every human being on the world, wherever they may be, from from the jungles of the Amazon to the Arctic to anywhere of the known world, we will find that human beings value justice. But why? It's because ultimately this is part of their makeup, their psychological and physical and spiritual makeup, which reminds them of the hereafter. Because we know as sure as anything that none of us get 100% perfect justice in this life. But yet, why are human beings looking for it? Because ultimately, in the hereafter, that's where you'll get it. And how do we know this? Because the Creator, who gave us the consciousness to recognize this, has sent communication to live our lives, to tell us what our purpose is, where we came from, and where our life is going, and what's going to happen on the other side of the death barrier. And this is why those people who do not accept this very universal and universally acceptable fundamental way of looking at life, man, life, and the universe, this worldview, the Islamic worldview, those people who choose not to accept it on that day when they will be judged and appraised for their life, they will be informed that they will have to spend the whole of eternity being punished. And the most stark thing about this is that they will admit that that's what is the right and deserving thing to happen to them. And so we can see that, I should hope that I have demonstrated that science really was never meant to discuss these points. But it's being used to justify these points and used to go into an area that it was never meant to go into. So what is ultimately science's place? Science is there, as I mentioned, to help us with our moral philosophy, help us fulfill our objectives and purposes. It's a tool. It's a tool to help us build civilizations. It is a way for us to understand the way the universe works, but ultimately according to the moral code that our designer, and we can call him God, has set for us. And this is how the Muslim civilization dealt with science. I mean, given that the Arabs before Islam had no interest in science or no interest in any form of knowledge, the only thing they were interested in was the knowledge of camels and Arabic language and poetry. That's all they were interested in. So when a man by the name of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he comes as a messenger from God with a communication which is subject to any tests that a human being can throw at it, he came with a book that was asking human beings to ponder and reflect on their life and their purpose in life. And not just that, it provided detailed descriptions of scientific phenomena that we were only able to know in the previous century. For example, it describes the development of the embryo in the mother's womb to such an amazing level of detail that Professor Keith Moore, a leading authority in obstetrics and gynecology, started his book with those verses of the Quran. Because this microscopic level of detail, which Muhammad definitely would not have had access to, was something of wonder to him. Or the fact that the Quran talks about the mountains are built on stakes, built on pegs. And we are only able to know that nowadays because we are now, due to engineering applications, we have to blow up major parts of mountains in order to build tunnels through them. And geologists have found indeed that mountains are built on these stakes. So given that now the Arab nation, and it began to spread, the religion of Islam began to spread because it was so logical and just irrefutable, then we find that within a matter of decades, people were accepting Islam. And not just that, and not just the material benefits, they were seeing the justice that was enacted therein. Because Islam is the only religion that has a comprehensive way a code of dealing with people that don't believe in it. It allows people that don't believe in it to have their own institutions, their own laws, their own communities. And the only jurisdiction that they have is when that community infringes upon the Muslim community. And this set about, can you imagine this atmosphere of justice, this atmosphere of peaceful coexistence, no doubtedly allowed the Muslims as well as other scientists within the Muslim countries and the Muslim states to start looking to science and developing what was already there. And again, using science for the service of humanity, for the service of providing engineering applications which would help human beings in their purpose, not to become the purpose in and of itself. Using science and the knowledge of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and such like, again, to make it subservient to the worldview and thereby ultimately developing human beings and making things better for them, because that is our role as a Muslim. And therefore, not just that, but even given the philosophical truth of Islam, it is no wonder that Islam will never have a problem with science, because there is nothing in it which, given that it has come from the one that has subjected the universe to scientific laws, you can see how philosophically you will never disagree with it. And this is very different to what the Christian experience was, because Christians in general cannot subject their scriptures to the level of rigor that Muslims can. Because for the Muslim, given that we use the logical sciences as well, and I'll illustrate this with a simple, we use logical sciences to determine the truth of scripture. How? In the same way that I've never been to China, but I believe China exists, even though scientifically I have no proof. Scientifically I have no proof, because the only thing I can say is I've tasted and smelled Chinese food. But that could be made in Japan, and it could be just there to trick me that it's from a place called China. So scientifically I can't argue that point. But my logic will tell me that there are so many different people who have talked about China, that there's no reasonable assumption that they are all colluding together to fool me into believing China exists. And this is the same attitude we have towards scripture. In that every single letter of the Quran and every single saying of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who has come to explain the Quran, has been rigorously authenticated to the point where it is the most rigorously authenticated information that we know about anything. In other words, if you reject Islamic scripture, you may as well reject World War II took place. Because the rigor that is involved in determining the authenticity of Islamic texts is more rigorous than the process to determine whether somebody is telling you the truth about an incident that happened in World War II, or whether World War II happened at all. Because it's using the same process. That Islamic Muslim scholars and those people who came to the conclusion that Islam is the truth have gone about making sure that the people who bring about information, that there's no way they could have colluded and made this information up. We can discuss this inshallah. I don't want to make this a lecture in and of itself, because it's a marvelous thing to look at the way Islamic scripture has come together. But this is the point I am trying to emphasize, that science has its place to be used as a tool, but ultimately to your worldview. Don't make it the worldview. Because really people the ones who are making it the worldview are rebelling against a lot of the time ignorant notions about what religion should be, and often rebelling against Christianity. Even I've heard Richard Dawkins on the radio after the last tsunami, the major tsunami that happened in 2004, that he brought up the time time-honored, time-dishonored argument of the problem of evil. That if a good God ultimately exists and He is all-powerful, why does evil occur? Now, for the Christian, this is problematic because the Christian believes that God is ultimately good, and they believe that evil comes from the devil. Whereas in Islam, God Himself has explained to us what the relation between good and evil is, by saying that الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. That it is He who has created life and death to test which of you is best in action. In other words, something will be evil to you from one particular angle, or bad or negative, whichever word you want to use. But ultimately, we know that human beings are strengthened by adversity. They are strengthened by dealing with by calamities. Don't we talk about heroes? In times of disaster, we see heroes come out, don't we? And we would never have known that that person had those heroic characteristics until that disaster happened, right? So sometimes adversity brings out an intense good. And this ties in with what Islam says, because Islam does not believe that there is ultimately pure evil. That good and evil is a spectrum of possibilities that God uses in order to test human beings, in order to enact that justice that we talked about, that will happen in the hereafter. So ultimately, that thing which is evil, if that person is so rewarded in such a way that that person then would go through that trial again, then surely you can argue that that thing is not evil anymore. That adversity, that phenomenon that happened to that person is now a source for their development, their source of their being raised in rank, or being a better person, if you want to use that phrase. So ultimately, we can say that. But again, we find that a lot of atheists, a lot of people that don't believe in God, are rebelling against the Christian idea of God. And given that we live in the West, and whether it's done sincerely or insincerely, if the atheist materialists are saying that, hey, if we can get rid of our religion, and we are the most impressive and advanced civilization today, surely everyone else should do that as well. Very simplistic way of looking at that, because again they're assuming that Christianity is the most advanced religion, which it clearly isn't. It has many problems, and again that's the subject of another lecture. But ultimately, we can understand that given the development of Christianity, which was not founded on logical, rational thought, even though logical, rational thought is employed within Christianity by a number of Christian theologians and philosophers, I'm not denying that, but it wasn't built up on this. Then we can, and again has logical absurdities within it, then we can see that it's no surprise that people went in reaction down the materialistic path. But again, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And the Islamic concept of God is extremely profound. It doesn't ascribe any form, human, anthropomorphic, form to God. It says God is not perceivable by the human being because God is outside the whole realm of limited and created things. And therefore we cannot imagine what God is like. And that's why you can see that the psychology that happens, and when you go into the Sistine Chapel or the great cathedrals of Christendom, that when you see images of God, then you can see why people begin to reject it. Because they see this man with a long beard in a white robe, that they cannot help but think that that is God, because that's what the images that they've been brought up with. I mean, for us, it's more like your mosque imam, isn't it? It's not really God. It's more like your mosque imam, if anything, so we don't have a problem with that. But you can see how people rebelling against this notion of God comes from this erroneous understanding of God. So again, what I invite everybody to do in the remaining 2 days of the Islamic Awareness Week is to find out about Islam. And find out about Islam and Not just that, but show what the Islamic belief is. Because believe it or not, a lot of people assume that it is very similar to Christianity. And it's time, inshallah, for the next 2 days for us to debunk those myths. So inshallah, I'll end my talk with that. وَأَقُولُ قَوْلِي هَذَا أَسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ لِي وَلَكُمْ وَلِسَائِرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ مِنْ كُلِّ ذَنْبٍ فَاسْتَغْفِرُوهُ إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. I pray that God forgives us and He guides us all. And inshallah, we can open up the floor for questions. Either they can be written down if people want it, or they can ask it from the floor, inshallah. So inshallah, we can make it fairly conversational and interactive, inshallah. Anybody like to kick off?
Yeah, I'll just check first. I'm an atheist, so anything I say might be rather interesting. And if you'd rather keep this a safe place for Islam and not have me come and talk, throw my weight around and ask silly questions, then that's fine. I won't ask anything.
No, I mean, actually, that's a very good point. I say, so what's your name?
Adam.
Adam. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's an interesting name. Given what we're talking about, very apt. You don't have a partner called you. No. I mean, that's actually a very good point, and you just reminded me of something very important. If you allow me, before we start. Muslims have never had a problem with intellectual debate. In fact, Muslim scholars, some of the most celebrated Muslim scholars, Imam Abu Hanifa, used to debate with atheists. It was never a problem. In the caliph's court, it used to be almost like a sport. What's happened nowadays is that, obviously due to the Salman Rushdie issue, the cartoons that happen, what the Muslims have a problem with. But firstly, I don't condone, ripping up embassies and doing any physical violence like that. And Muslims don't condone that. Unfortunately, what Muslims do not have, and actually part of the work that the Islamic Society is doing here, and the work that I do, is reminding Muslims of that intellectual heritage. Because I don't blame you for actually asking that question, and I really think,
Christian society, Jewish society.
Excellent.
Always worth checking.
And absolutely, and I think that's, I really thank you for your politeness in doing that. But again, I'd like to reiterate, and I think the Islamic Society have to reiterate this, that a lot of people think that Muslims are intolerant to discussion simply because actions that people, our fellow brethren in faith, go and do. And ultimately it's a problem. I mean, ultimately the argument in Islam is simply this. We have no problem with intellectual debate. You can question anything that we hold. The only thing that Muslims have a problem with, and again we should use lawful means by doing this, rather than anything else, is when people resort to abusing freedom of speech for either insulting or debasing, because we ourselves are forbidden from insulting or debasing other views, whether they're atheists or whether they're idolatrous or anything like that. The Quran categorically forbids us because it says that people will respond to you in kind, and it's quite basic. So as human beings, yes, let's keep the arguments intelligent, let's keep them intellectual, and you're free to ask anything.
Okay, I asked because if God was an atheist society, people started coming in and spouting their own views without checking it would be rude.
Absolutely. So please,
can I just ask what your understanding of the theory of evolution by natural selection actually is?
Excellent question. Evolution, as you know, has got a number of parts to it. It's got, for example, the process of natural selection. So Muslims per se, the orthodox Muslim view is that we have no problem with the concept of species evolving due to certain conditions and place and time and due to certain processes. And that's evident. Scientifically, that is absolutely evident. What Islam says is a stretch is the creation of Adam and human beings from apes or from any other type of Neanderthal or any other type of being. Because on a number of levels. One, because we have a communication that is philosophically more sound than the theory of evolution and science itself. That's one reason. And secondly, more subsidiary to that, is that subsidiary to that is that there is no real evidence of those species that came in between. And to answer also, to go back to the natural selection idea, that, again, using the basic philosophical premise that something which has, again, a form and function, there must be some intelligence behind it, no matter how that intelligence takes place. For example, when you have species such as butterflies, now there's a butterfly that when it puts its wings together, it looks like the eyes of an owl, and it staves off certain predators, like frogs and toads and such like, or lizards. Now, the question begs, how did, or what was the process by which genetically the DNA or the genes or whatever knew that, you know what, in order to protect this species going forward, it would need to have a pigmentation of another species to stave that off. This, it seems absurd that that is random.
My answer to that would be that that is natural selection itself. You start with a butterfly, let's say you've got two of them. One of them has slightly more pigmentation on it than the other, which therefore causes predators to be more fearful of it. Okay? This one doesn't. So this one, the predators are less afraid, they eat it, it's gone, out of the gene pool. This one goes on to have children with another butterfly. Therefore that gene, which has the slight more pigmentation, is expressed. Now you accelerate that over thousands of years, where each time the one with the most pigmentation on it proceeds to pass on its genetic code. That's natural selection. So therefore the characteristics get exaggerated over time, meaning that when you get to the end result, what we see today is the butterfly with the little pigment on it that looks like owl, that looks like a owl does.
But again, if you just abstract that, I see what you're saying. I know I understand the process. That's fine. That's fine. But for it to be to a certain level where even that, I can understand that how certain colours will be eliminated. What you're saying is that the colours that are eliminated, but surely you will see signs and there'll be evidence of, because obviously you believe it's random, yes? Do you believe natural selection is random?
What do you mean by random?
In other words, it is not according to a fixed process. Sorry, let me clarify that. It's not according to a predetermined process.
That's a very loaded question, because natural selection, like I just explained, is the characteristics of a single animal that allow it to have superiority over others,
yes,
being selected by the others being killed, eaten, whatever, meaning that the best characteristics survive.
Right. Okay. So okay, just to go that. So therefore, the fact that certain species are eaten and some are not, that's random, isn't it? For purposes of scientific,
not really random, because the ones with the best characteristics will survive.
But
it's like the multiplex, isn't it?
Yeah, just like control.
Is the best. The iPhone is the best. Let's just say that for sake.
That's what we're going to get really offended by. That's going to cause trouble here.
It makes the most money.
Yes.
Which beats HTC or any other leading smartphone brand. So therefore, iPhone makes the most money. It's the same theory. The one with the best characteristics survive and go on. That's natural selection. That's what it is.
I get that. Yeah. I understand.
So if the conditions change, then the ones with the most characteristics will again change.
You can understand. Okay, that's fine. I understand that. So now it's so that by certain conditions, we see that something comes out on top. Yeah, ends up being superior. If we use the word, if we're going to say that, than others.
Yeah.
Understood. But the fact is that when you look at the pigmentation, it shows what you would say in the same way that this bottle has a form and form. That you would never assume that this is randomly developed, right? In the same way, when you look at, and it's not just, I mean, the whole issue of camouflage in the natural world for animals and plants and the like, is, I mean, I can see how you can see that a certain colour will put off certain animals, but when you see that it looks like another species, I mean, maybe I should bring a presentation and actually show it in action, but when you see it, it is absolutely phenomenal, Adam, and if you look at it, you can also, you see it, but you see, it's a bit of a leap of faith, if I may use that word, sorry, finish that point. It's a bit of a leap of faith to say, but that's what happens over thousands of years, because you don't really have any evidence for that. It is a bit, let's face it, it's a theory, which you can't say is 100% proven, even scientists would say that. They would say it's a reasonable assumption given, if we track the development, it is what scientists would call a reasonable assumption based on certain past experiences, right? Yeah. But that's a sign of intelligence, Adam, because the definition of intelligence is that that something which uses some previous information that they act in a different way. But the fact that it comes to such a stark reality, I mean, for example, even stick insects. You can appreciate that for an insect to look like a stick is going to help itself. You can understand maybe some certain colours will be eliminated for reasons that you mentioned, because they stick out like a sore thumb. A pink insect is going to get eaten on something which is generally in the Amazon rainforest, but it sticks out like a sore thumb. But again, you don't see that example of randomness. If you are going to say that natural selection is ordered but random, or it happens by certain processes taking place that is engineered towards a certain direction, then you would see examples of failed species and failed pigmentation, which you don't. You see it going
That's why
out.
you don't see them, because of natural selection, because they were failed, so they're no longer around.
Okay.
You can't detect skin colours over millions of years. They wouldn't still be here. You wouldn't be able to detect them because they weren't as good as the green ones. The green ones lived, the green ones survived, the green ones broke.
Okay, so there could have been shocking pink coloured stick insects.
The way that it works is a very minute, mutation, that's the word.
His lipless
a
coming
very
out.
minute mutation in the DNA that causes a very minor change.
Yeah.
And that's where it comes from. So the green may not have been originally, a vibrant dark green. It might have been like blue, and then the one that was slightly more green survived. There may have been ones that were slightly more pink.
Yes.
But we're not talking as in sort of, vibrant
colours. Yeah. Okay, so you're saying there's actually exactly.
And then if you give it the millions and trillions and billions of years that it could have possibly had, for it to evolve that long, then it's more than possible. It's just as equally possible.
Yeah.
The probability of it, I would go as far to say, is just as equally possible as an intelligent designer coming up with the idea, that the best way to create this would be to put the eyes of another predator on the back of its wings. The probability of it is not that different. So why is one so much better than the other? Why is it so much more probable that an intelligent designer did it? But what you're asking there is a huge probability that, as opposed to a few atoms colliding, the universe creating over infinite limits of time, a massive super being was involved. A massive one, maybe not involved. But a massive super being was involved.
Okay. See, that's the conflation here. Basically, there's two things here. As you mentioned, the probability is basically absurd, because for example, if we were to put anything in order, for example, if you've got a bag of 10 marbles, number 1 to 10, if you were to bring them out in order 1, 2 to 10, the chance of that is 1 in 26 million. Okay. Now the problem with that is that that's a very simple system. So the big ask is, you see, unfortunately, the problem is that by increasing the random sample of the universe, and thereby saying, well, there's bound for one to have been right, versus the idea, because look, what I'm saying is that as a human being, the idea that the basic conclusion that human beings find is that if something has order, has a mechanism, that it has been made by something. Let's not go into that something right now, we can come on to that in a minute. So if we see that there is a process of evolution, which is what we're talking about right now, then it is more reasonable to assume that there's an intelligent being. We're talking about, when it comes to philosophy, this is, sorry to use these big words at this late time of day, but this is the ontological understanding that there is intelligence. Forget what that nature of that being is, that comes into another part of philosophy. But it's perfectly reasonable to assume that there is something that started it off. As for what that something is, that has to go into a different realm, which I'll discuss in a minute. That's more reasonable for a human being to assume than something that says that there was a completely random experiment, a random process going on in the universe, with an infinite sample, which again has not been proven yet anyway, for that thing to come about. Because ultimately, while we can say that if there were an infinite number of monkeys with infinite typewriters, that one of them will come up with the entire works of Shakespeare, probabilistically we could say that in an infinite sample. But we know that's absurd for that to happen. In other words, when you go home today and you find that there's a pink monster coming in your middle, you're sitting in the middle of your living room, you won't say, you know what, that's just one of those random things happening. Budge up, make space for me on the sofa, and then hopefully it'll go away again. You won't do that. You will be shocked, you will be amazed, you will wonder what on earth is going on. Because you as a human being don't live like that. You live your life according to certain patterns, and you know that certain patterns that happen in your life are certain set ways. And for you will not be a human being if you accepted this infinite sample. The problem is that for me, the infinite sample is a cop-out and is like the faith of the Christians, because it's like this. Okay, but it must be this way because this is what happened. You see, because it's not been proven.
But that's firstly, yeah, pink monsters would be absolutely terrifying. But that's a big change. I'm not asking you to believe in a big change. I'm asking you to believe in a lot of very tiny ones. And very tiny probabilities are perfectly coherent. For example, don't know your name, but you're eating a sandwich. The chances of you biting either end of the sandwich equally probable. It's totally random.
Why are you my lecture for?
Right?
Go.
So, I mean, asking you to eat from one end of the sandwich might not seem like that big a deal at the moment, but let's say that makes you slightly more full, so you put down that sandwich slightly earlier. Let's say you do that 1,000,000 times, suddenly you're as skinny as a bone. And also just eating less sandwiches, you'll get really skinny, really loose. It's not that big an ask.
Yes.
But to ask him to eat the entire sandwich would be very random, very strange, and you'd probably feel a bit sick.
Yeah.
My point's not so like complicated because I'm trying to make it off the bat. But what I'm saying is, loads of tiny probabilities are considerably more likely than one big one. You're asking me to believe in the big one, you know, saying the big monster, I wouldn't believe in it. I agree with you. For the same way that I see the idea of something creating it to be a big ask.
No,
it's a big probability.
Okay, this is the problem when you're discussing with a mathematician here, so that's why I can say this. You see, what you're talking about independent probabilities occurring. When you've got independent probabilities coming, you don't add the probabilities, you multiply them together. For independent probabilities to happen, so the probability of A and B happening, you multiply the probabilities together. So you are multiplying each minute probability by another, by another, by another, and you're getting smaller, and you're getting smaller, and you're getting smaller. To the point of absurdity. Because within mathematics, there are certain things, like even the concept of infinity isn't a real concept. It's a helpful imaginary concept, like I mentioned, like the square root of -1. It has no tangible value, but it's helpful. The problem is that in here, when it comes to determining what is ultimately the meaning of life, really, then the idea that these are random and therefore probabilistic, and the fact that they happened is frankly absurd compared with the idea ontologically. I mean, the principle of it. Forget the nature of God right now, that's a separate subject. The ontological possibility that there is an intelligent creator that set this into being and set this into motion and gave it its, if you want to imagine it like a very super intelligent engineer, if you like. That's not a problem to expect, because we as human beings can accept that from an ontological point of view. As to what the nature of that creator or that designer is, then philosophically that can only be by that being telling us what that is, because obviously we can't look outside the limits of our intellect, can we?
Okay. I think I'll just make the same point that I'm going to make again.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to move on. We'll be here until about
maybe.
But the probability of that, I mean, it's difficult to argue probabilities without numbers. I'm certain it's a matter.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was trying to do that.
Of something as vast as an intelligent designer coming into creation and creating everything, surely that probability itself can't be any bigger than the possibility of lots of tiny small changes.
That's where I differ. That's why I say that's why
we'll be here.
That's why I differ, because for example, let's put it this way. The probability that you're here right now, for me, is irrelevant because you're here right now. Okay? What we're saying is that there is the necessary, the fact that we are here makes it the necessary existence of that. It's not a probability. It's outside the realm of probability. That's what I'm trying to say here. That this does not come into probability, because probability is to do with, because we made an assumption. You're making the assumption that the universe is a random sample of multiple things happening. I'm saying that by the virtue of the fact that we as human beings exist, that it makes it the philosophical 100% certainty that there is a designer. I think we're probably going to have to end it there. But what I'd like to add, I'll give you my card afterwards. Maybe we can continue this via email. That would be great. I think that would be really great.
Last person I tried to do that with was a text, and then he got very cross with me very quickly and refused to talk to me.
Really? Christian, I imagine, was it?
Yeah.
Oh,
just a little bit.
Well, it's quite interesting because earlier in the middle of last year, we actually did discuss with a Texan who's the head of the American Atheists. But we had a fantastic relationship. We still have a great relationship. I think it was I can't remember his name now. But anyway, it was something that we discussed. I was really shocked that Texan could be an atheist. I thought that was a bit surprising. I don't know what the probability of that is. That's a whole different subject. Anybody got any other questions or comments regarding again science and science in relation to religion or anything like that? I think probably we want to wrap up because it's come to our sunset prayer time. Yeah. But thank you, Jazakumullah khairan, for all of you for coming. Thank you very much for Adam. I think this is great because I think this is the way that we can really understand each other more, and I think that's really what these awareness weeks are about. Thank you very much for coming and expressing your ideas. Excellent. Inshallah, we'll end with subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.